Greetings. In the last mini lecture, which was the ninth mini lecture, I kind of left you really in a very bad place. We had created this new government called the Articles of Confederation, and the Articles of Confederation had several weaknesses, and they had very, very quickly been exposed. The country, remember, was essentially bankrupted because under the Articles, the national government couldn't tax. The states were squabbling because there was no federal court system. And so there was no umpire to resolve disputes between the states. And of course, at the very tail end of the last mini lecture, I talked about Shays' Rebellion, which exposed the potential weakness of this new government not having an army or a navy. Remember, Shays' Rebellion was a farmers' revolt in western Massachusetts that to many represented the fact that this new country, our new government, was teetering on societal anarchy. And so there was a constitutional convention called for Philadelphia. Remember, the initial call was, hey, we need to fix what's wrong. And many people thought that was what was going to happen. Perhaps Congress would be given the power to tax. There would be a power to raise an army and a navy and possibly give the president a new role of commander in chief. And that perhaps they would create a federal judiciary, perhaps a Supreme Court to resolve these disputes between the states. So the thought was, okay, we've created a government that's too weak. We need to reform it, and we'll be fine. When we get to the Constitutional Convention, and here you can turn to your notes, you see that there was a huge predicament or task, and I've talked about this before, but here I'll put it all together. The predicament or task was, how do we avoid the twin political evils of tyranny and anarchy? Remember when the founders were putting together our first government, the Articles of Confederation, the only evil that they saw was tyranny. They were fighting a war against perceived British tyranny. They'd lived under the threat of societal anarchy under the Articles of Confederation. And so now we have a situation where the delegates understand that a government is too strong, as I pointed out in the last lecture. A government that is too strong can take away your liberties or rights, but unfortunately, a government that is too weak will be unable to protect your liberties or your rights. So, in this particular case, the goal or objective, and I stole this from Berman, if you're wondering who Berman is in your notes, I stole this first bullet point from him. The goal or objective was, how do we navigate between these two evils? How do we create a government that is stronger than the Articles of Confederation, but not as strong as the British government that we had fought a revolution against? Now, keep in mind that all of the delegates, all of them, want to avoid both tyranny and anarchy. But the delegates have a very different emphasis. So the people who called the convention, I'm going to use the term the Nationalists. The name pretty much tells you what they want. The Nationalists want to create a new, a much stronger national government. The Nationalists believe that the Articles of Confederation cannot be reformed, and therefore there needs to be a whole new written constitution with a lot more power in a whole variety of areas. So they don't want to reform the Articles. The Nationalists want to totally transform it into a much stronger national government with national supremacy. And the reason for this is that the Nationalists were terrified by what was going on in the country. Shays' Rebellion was a symbol to the Nationalists that the country was teetering on societal anarchy and that perhaps these were the first shots of a second American Revolution. So the Nationalists want a much stronger national government. The anti-nationalists, they acknowledge that the nationalists have a point. Certainly, the anti-nationalists agree that the Articles of Confederation are too weak. And they come to the convention as reformers. Their basic point is, look, we've lived under this new government just like you have. We understand what its weaknesses are. So let's just fix those. Let's just fix what's wrong and leave everything else. So if we're nearly bankrupt because the national government can't tax, let's allow that. If not having an army or a navy to provide order internally and to protect, for example, as I mentioned in an earlier mini lecture, to protect our shipping going up and down the Mississippi River, and we need a few naval ships, let's do that. Let's create an army. Let's create a navy. Let's create an umpire to resolve disputes between the states. But the anti-nationalists want to keep as much of the Articles of Confederation as possible. For example, they claim that representation under the Articles was fine, so we can keep representation based on geography and all the states being equal, for example. So this debate between the nationalists and the anti-nationalists is a tug of war between what is our primary need to remedy. Is it that the national government is so weak that we need to radically transform this government and create a much stronger one? Or are the problems very specific and therefore they can be remedied with very specific solutions? And therefore we don't have to change the basic structure of the Articles of Confederation at all. So that is the basic battleground. I will just give you my bias. Obviously, nobody wants tyranny, and very few people want anarchy. So I tried to put myself in 1787. That's really, really difficult. I've read a lot about the period, but certainly living during that time would be very different than reading about it. But I actually do fear anarchy more than tyranny. So I have a feeling that I would have been somewhere in between the nationalists and anti-nationalists, but leaning towards the nationalists. So I think I would have been arguing that we need to create a new national government. And if there's anything from the articles that still makes sense, then why don't we use those ideas? And I gave you one example of that in an earlier mini lecture when I told you that the United States Senate, in terms of composition, right, that the Senate represents states, well, that's what the Congress did under the Articles. In the U.S. Senate today, every state is represented equally. Under the Articles, every state was represented equally. So there would be an example of something in the Articles of Confederation that we could kind of rewrap and then go with it from there. So, I like to tell you kind of what my area of emphasis is. Again, in the discussion board, or if you want to contact me, or if you guys want to communicate with each other in that Q&A cafe that I have listed under the first module about which evil do you think is worse, tyranny or anarchy. I think it would be an interesting discussion. And again, uh, be respectful. It's okay to disagree. Um, Take the other person's opinion seriously. And if you disagree, tell them why you disagree. But again, don't make this personal. Don't go after people on an individual lesson. We're all kind of a campus community here and want this to be more of an exchange of ideas in a learning experience more than anything else. All right, so both want to avoid tyranny and anarchy, but the two groups have very different emphasis. If we go to the areas of consensus, the reason why I've added this is almost always the Constitution is portrayed as a bundle of compromises. And there's no question that it is a bundle of compromises, and we're going to talk about all three of these items in the next couple of mini lectures after today. But in the nearly 5 minutes that I have left, I want to very quickly go over areas of consensus because the delegates did agree on a few fundamental rules of the game. And if you're going to have successful negotiations, then there needs to be some mutual trust and there need to be an agreement kind of on what game you're playing. So here were three really important areas of consensus. The first one was that the new government will be a republic. Think back to those circles, right? Modeled on Rome, not a democracy like Athens. So we are not going to have a system like in California where people can qualify a measure for the ballot through signature gathering and then pass the law later on. The people can do that in California without the intervention of representatives. But the delegates at the convention did not trust the people. Uh, some quotes by founding fathers about democracy. Democracy is the worst of all political evils. I've never seen a democracy that did not murder, waste, and exhaust itself. Democracy is a political system in which 51% of the people can take away the liberty and property of the other 49%. So we're going to have a republic modeled after Rome, okay? And we do. And we elect representatives to Congress. We informally kind of elect the president. We don't elect our Supreme Court justices. They're nominated by the president and confirmed by the Senate. Second, that idea of Montesquieu that I mentioned earlier, right? That the new government will have both separation of powers. So some people will be in the Congress, there'll be a person who's president, there'll be some Supreme Court justices. In our political system, an individual can only serve in one role at a time. So a congressman cannot also serve on the Supreme Court, or a congressman cannot be our president. If you look at Great Britain has fusion of powers. The Prime Minister, Mr. Johnson in Britain, is also a member of the British House of Commons at the same time. So if we had the British model, President Trump would also be a member of the U.S. House of Representatives, and that is specifically forbidden in the American political system. There will also be checks and balances. I talked about this earlier. So Congress passes a law, the president vetoes it. The Congress and the president pass a law, the Supreme Court strikes it down with judicial review, declaring it unconstitutional. There's power sharing between the states and the national government that we call federalism. And once again, I will get into that in a lot of detail later on. But everyone agreed that there needed to be safeguards, and certainly this power fragmentation is the key to this political system, and separation of powers and checks and balances are the first two of those means of power fragmentation. The last one, be wary of. Maybe put some stars next to it and some exclamation marks and some question marks, because here we start to see a transition. So there is an area of consensus. All of the delegates agree that the national government has to be supreme in some areas. The national government has to be stronger. Some delegates just want to give them the power to tax, the power to raise a military, and the power to raise a court. Others want national supremacy to be comprehensive. One of the proposals is that the national government could override any state law whatsoever. So there is a huge difference between those that want the national government to be given very specific powers and those that want to allow the national government to be supreme over the states in all areas. In the next mini lectures, we will talk about areas of conflict at the convention.